This week on the Wheelhouse. Online political rhetoric, dehumanizing language, violence against women. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. This hour, we're asking how polarizing content and digital language makes its way into politics. The Department of Defense and the Homeland Security Department have recently used language present in fringe and extreme online spaces. Later, we'll discuss how online misogyny is linked to real-world violence. But first, we'll learn about extremist language and the platforms creators use it on. Ji-Yoon Suk is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. Ji-Yoon, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for the invite, and thanks for having me.
Excited to talk to you, Ji-Yoon. Adam Alexic is a linguist, online creator known as the Etymology Nerd. He's also the author of Algo Speak, How Social Media is Transforming the Future of Language. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, excited to be here.
Excited to talk to you. Ji-Yoon, I'm going to give you the first question here. I do want to invite folks to give us a call, 888-720-9677. They may also send us an email, but you also may watch live on our YouTube stream as well. Ji-Yoon, your work details how social media platforms are designed. Talk to us about how social media has evolved over the last decade.
Yeah, sure. So social media, when it was first introduced by, for example, like in the form of Facebook or Twitter, like in late 2000 or something, it was like a celebratory platform or technology to connect users across different parts of the world, to share their, their lives, do some expressions and engage with other people. Like it was like a celebratory platform and technology, and it was celebratory because it had like a lower bar for ordinary users to participate in like a public discussions, which was not possible like for example, in 18th century or 19th century, because the bar to participate in public discussions and politics was high, and women and minoritized citizens were not able to participate. In that sense, social media platforms served as like a celebratory technology. However, over time, one thing to note is that social media platforms are not 100% neutral space. It's not 100% politically neutral. What I mean by that is it is carefully designed with some kind of intentional choices. For example, some kind of design features or technological features or some kind of affordances that provides certain opportunities and constraints for user engagement and user participation. So algorithm, for example, is one example, or recommendation systems is another example, which naturally drive users to engage with more certain content. For example, research shows that emotionally charged content or politically charged content are more likely to drive engagement and user participation. So the technological features are naturally designed to incentivize those kind of highly engaging content. In that sense, social media platform, though it seems like because of the low bar for participation and it's accessible to everyone, it seems like democratizing the participation, but at the same time, due to those kind of strategic features and affordances and constraints that platforms provide, it has become a platform and digital space where certain ideas or certain voices or certain content are more likely to be amplified and become visible than others.
What are we seeing social media algorithms prioritize today?
So research shows that the content that is emotionally engaging, um, positive content or negative content, or those compared to the neutral, emotionally neutral content, are more likely to drive participation and engagement, especially those with like a frustration or anger are more likely to drive participation and engagement. Also, at the same time, research also shows that like false information and fake news are more likely to drive engagement and travel faster than true information because those are those may be emotionally laden and ideologically charged.
Can you briefly walk us through this process of the content on the fringes of online spaces that then makes its way to mainstream content?
Yeah, sure. So like those content or ideas or culture that are part of the that has been part of the fringe communities, not that the mainstream, could potentially be circulated among themselves, but once it gets picked up by algorithm and platform design, it can be really amplified. For example, the thing is, users do not just stay in one platform. Users also migrate across different platforms, and therefore their ideas and their languages and content also traverse across different platforms. So even though their original rhetoric or idea or language might have started from like a one single social media space or online network, uh, because users do migrate across different platforms, those ideas also traverse across different digital spaces. And when they reach like different digital spaces, again, going back to the platform design and algorithms, especially when they are like emotionally charged and politically charged, they're more likely to get amplified and picked up by other users, therefore becoming part of the mainstream discussion. And here I'm talking about the role of the platform algorithm and platform architecture. But I want to make sure that at the same time, users are also more likely to consolidate ideas that are like-minded. So users also have a tendency to respond to like-minded views. So it's like a two-way street. It's also it's not only the platform but also the users, how users respond to it.
Adam, we talked about how polarizing content becomes part of our mainstream content. One recent example are so-called incels. This is a subculture of men online. Adam, can you clarify for us who incels are and how they fit into our conversation about extreme content?
Yeah, incels or involuntary celibates who are people who believe that they cannot participate in normal social relationship dynamics because they are less attractive and all of society is ranking people based on attractiveness in their worldview. One of their fringe forums that they started on was in 1997, Alana's Involuntary Celibate Forum, and they were originally called Incels with a V, and then they dropped the V. Then they moved to 4chan. In 4chan, they create kind of this incubator for all kinds of language and ideas that radicalize them far further than before. And it turns into this misogynistic sort of stomping ground for what I would say are very atomizing, reductive ideas. Then these ideas, I would say, are mainly spreading in the form of humor. So these are less, oh, it's emotional content and it's causing people to be angry and that's why it's spreading. It's more broadening the window of what is okay to say through jokes and irony, which can be used as a cloaking mechanism where it's, all right, it's not me, it's an ironic joke, but then that sort of opens the window to discussion for this sort of idea. So there's a plausible deniability to the joke, and that is one of the high arousal emotions which triggers a user response on social media.
Here's one definition from Vice. Incels are an online subculture of men who form their identity around their perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships. Many incels have a nihilistic perspective of the self, strong misogynistic beliefs about women, and importantly, share the view that society hates them. I want to play a clip here of an online creator called Clavicular, whose real name is Braden Peters. According to the New York Times, He's known for looks maxing, an online subculture of men that has blown up in legacy media in recent months. The looks maxing community has been here for a while. We were talking about this as well, though, in the first administration. Says Eurocentric standards of male beauty and masculinity are the keys to achievement. The community repeatedly demeans women through TikToks and Instagram clips. Here's Peters talking on the Adam Friedland show about women trying to become online looks maxers.
Sometimes there will be girls who try to like LARP their way into the community when it's meant to be a male-dominated space, or just like a male space in general, because women have just an exponentially easier time living life.
What do you hear when you listen to that, Adam?
Well, I picked up on the word LARP, which comes from live action role play, but is now sort of an incel slang word that's breaking into the mainstream. But yeah, just kind of this classic misogyny. Actually, incels started out by Alana, a woman who started this thing, and then it was taken command of and is really used to build this male identity. And what clavicular is he's not an incel, actually. Incels are, clavicular has lots of sexual relations. There's sort of concentric circles of how these ideas spread. At the core, the people who are creating the most language and are spending the most time online are incels on these obscure forums. Then there's a circle around them, the looks maxers, the black pill community, as it's called. So taking the black pill means you are accepting incel philosophy. And so we'll see the suffix pilled show up. If I really like burritos, I can say I'm burrito pilled. And technically that traces all the way back to the Matrix with the idea of taking the red pill or the blue pill, and there was the red pill in politics. But the black pill is what made that into a productive suffix. So the idea that you could realize that, oh yeah, looks are everything and join our movement creates this sort of like flawed acceptance into the philosophy that then within that black pill, there are different groups. So the looks maxers are people who believe they can still ascend into kind of more odd status in society simply by doing surgical cosmetics, by going to the gym. That's called gym maxing. So maxing is maximizing some part of your appearance. But clavicular is in that looks maxing group. And then there's the general manosphere, which is adjacent to all this and maybe not directly subscribing to these ideas, but the ideas still filter through.
Adam, Wired notes that clavicular's videos often have captions that to outsiders make little sense. Here's one. Clavicular ran into a frat leader at ASU and got brutally frame-mogged by him. Clavicular streams on Kick, where content moderation is loosely compared to spots like Twitch or YouTube, and the videos often get boosted by advertisers regardless of their hateful or misogynistic content. So talk more about the language you hear like frame mogging and see in these looks maxing videos.
Yeah, Clavicular isn't posting these videos. He's doing a live stream and then it's being clip farmed. And clip farming is he is about 20 people or more that he's hired to look at his videos, find viral snippets, and then post them on Twitter or on other platforms for online success. And that both brings Clavicular more viewers to his stream eventually, and the clip farmers get to make something off of Twitter in that moment. But what you have is this sort of incentive, this perverse incentive to make more and more viral content. It doesn't matter what the content is as long as you're clip farming. And this is unfortunately a easy way to get distribution above all else, above whether the messaging preserves human kindness or anything. As long as you make a clip go viral, you're making money. So there's literally this incentive that exists.
Is this bizarre algo speak that we see in these videos a way to get around online filters and promote extreme hateful content while still being able to get that ad revenue?
I would say less of it when we talk about clavicular gesture maxing and getting frame mogged in the club is about algo speak and more about how these words are interchangeable with trending keywords. So kind of like SEO data, search engine optimization data. All words are now viewed by the algorithm and are trending in their own right, and the algorithm pushes trends that go viral. Humans resonate with words that we find absurd. We are amused by the idea of linguistic play, that we can find new words in new situations, and also serves as an in-group indicator that if you know this tweet, you are part of the in-group of people who speak this online vernacular. That creates a feeling of exclusivity for the exact same reason that the incels also have these words in the first place. Now, these words are parroting how incels talk, so there's maybe a subversive element there that resonates beyond the incelosphere and can be used ironically. However, the incels themselves have this very obscure language that is used within their community because it creates that in-group feeling of identity for them, almost creating a cult-like hierarchy of either you know the language or you're a normie.
Often we hear claviculars say things like mogging, as we mentioned, or chads. It invokes a type of hierarchy. What is the hierarchy and how are they defining it?
Yeah, the idea is the incels at the bottom, then you have normies in the middle who aren't aware of this sociosexual hierarchy, and then on top you have chads or giga chads, and there's a ranking that they've tried to normalize and make scientific, but there's a ranking of who is more and less attractive in society. And mogging is essentially emasculation. Somebody higher in the hierarchy can just show up next to someone with a smaller frame and frame mog them. So that's a dynamic that exists. All male-to-male interactions in the incel worldview and in the looks-maxing worldview are one of emasculation, and all male-to-female interactions are inherently sexual. It creates a very binary view of the world.
This indicates that the way we are talking online, Ji-yoon, is evolving. But now that our culture has expanded here online, do you see any relationship between extremist rhetoric online and how politicians are talking in the real world?
Yes, absolutely. So when those kind of extremist language, rhetoric, and ideas circulate from fringe spaces to the mainstream spaces, when it gets picked up and amplified by political elites, it becomes like a pathway of normalizing and legitimizing those kind of ideas. The problem with the incel, for example, is that the highly specific language developed by those fringe communities, which was once confined to like very niche corners of the internet, has bled into the mainstream digital culture and everyday vocabulary among social media users. And then when those kind of language is picked up by the for example, institutions or political elites and political politicians, it means that the ideas and the culture behind the language becomes normalized and potentially accelerate the adoption of that language and diffusion of that language.
I want to get your take on this, Adam. What do you think about this kind of seeping into the real world and how politicians are sort of using this language?
Yeah, the Pentagon recently posted about lethality maxing, drawing on that looks maxing idea of maximizing something for humorous effect, too. The White House is effectively clip farming right now, the same way that people were clip farming about clavicular. You take a viral idea and you spin it in your own way, and it becomes more viral. And if it's used by a prestige group, then it goes more viral. The concern here is that there's a concept called the Overton window, which is the range of acceptable discourse in society. And it's generally thought that this window moves the more a certain kind of idea is represented. So the Overton window used to not allow gay marriage. We didn't think about that as possible until the gay liberation movement and more people started talking about it. And the window moved that eventually gay marriage was legalized. So the idea is there's an Overton window of how acceptable misogyny is in society, or this looks-maxing black pill idea is in society. And the more we're talking about it, the more we're ambiently normalizing this sort of rhetoric. And certainly there are thousands of new people on these incel forums every single year. The idea is definitely gaining traction, which is highly concerning.
Adam, we see this language popping up everywhere from TikTok to the Department of Defense. The X account from the DoD recently posted low cortisol, locked in, lethality maxing. There's also an example from John Oliver. He's reading an email his show received from the Department of Homeland Security. Here's that clip.
I have to tell you, we reached out to DHS for comment and they angrily denied any dog whistles, adding, "We will not apologise for using patriotic messaging and symbolism in our advertisements." They also told us, and I quote, One could say we are homeland maxing by removing illegal aliens and defending our borders, a sentence I genuinely feel dumber for saying out loud.
The lines between language and political and digital language and political language are blurring. What's that impact?
Well, they've always been blurring. The concern is, again, that idea of we're normalizing this, and it wasn't something that was normalized before. I think irony can be a two-sided sword, where one, it is used to criticize the incels, and I think a lot of these jokes can be read on the side of the left as mocking incel speech. However, it can be used the other way too, where it turns into a misogynistic dog whistle. So it really depends on context and application. But the fact is that the more people who are saying this, the easier it is to push through kind of Trojan horse an idea into the mainstream discourse.
Going back to so-called incel culture, are there specific ideologies or beliefs that incels largely share? If so, what are they?
The main ideology is the black pill, this idea that looks are everything and that there is a set ranking between individuals that you can hope to ascend through looks maxing, but the bottom tier, the bottom 2% or something, will be unable to ever ascend no matter how much they try to improve their appearance through going to the gym or surgery or whatever. And this group is the incels. Outside of that are still very dangerous communities that do not identify as incels, but are adjacent, the looks maxers and the manosphere and so on.
You think the language has been effective in recruiting people into incel forums who are adopting this ideology?
It's intriguing in the same way that a traffic accident is intriguing and you want to slow down and rubberneck and look at it. There's something fascinating about it, and people are drawn to learn more about these words, and then that creates the feeling of joining this selective group. A lot of these incel forums are anonymous. 4chan, where a lot of these words started out, was anonymous. And that anonymity created a sort of pressure. We've talked about platform affordances. There's a pressure to demonstrate that you are part of this in-group. So you need a shared proficiency in slang that shows that you are not a normie. And it becomes an identity marker for these groups.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You've been listening to Ji-Yoon Suk, a professor in the Department of Communication at UConn. Thank you for coming on the show, Ji-Yoon.
Thank you so much.
Adam Alexic, author and linguist, is going to stay with us for a little bit while longer. They'll stay to talk about the conversation here. Online language is a political tool. We'll also be joined by a new friend. How do you see online culture permeating politics? Hit us up, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. There's more Wheelhouse after this. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. As our online interactions evolve, internet silos once considered fringe are spilling over into mainstream politics. We're talking about how the line blurs between online jokes and real-world violence today with Adam Alexic, linguist and online creator. He's the author of the 2025 book, Algo Speak, How Social Media is Transforming the Future of Language. Adam, thank you for sticking with us.
Hi.
Also, Dr. Saeed Hill, a counseling psychologist and independent consultant in the field of men and masculinities. He's also president-elect of the Society for the Psychology of Men and Masculinities at the American Psychological Association. Saeed, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me this morning, Frankie. Appreciate it.
Folks, do you have any thoughts on the internet as a political tool? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Saeed, lethality maxing. We've heard Pete Hegseth use it. Would you say the administration is using terms found in forums that spread misogynistic and racist ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. There seems to be an appeal to it. So I really appreciate what Adam was saying earlier. I mean, it signals to people listening to it that you're part of this community. You're one of us. And honestly, what it does do, it buys into a lot of the community or the desire for community that a lot of these young men have and desire. A lot of the reasons they find their ways into these communities is because they feel maybe a specific lack of social confidence. And so, when you have somebody in high positions of government who actually looks the way that Pete does as well, it kind of signals that look at these good looking people who have all of the power and control, and we're one of them, we're with them. And what it honestly does, it also allows for maybe the administration and people who use this kind of terminology to kind of, get away with a little bit more too. Because honestly, if it seems like we're on your team, and we use this sort of language, it allows you to look the other way while we continue to do whatever we want to do because we won't have as much pushback. So what it might intentionally kind of do, and maybe unintentionally in some circumstances, kind of creates a feeling of obedience from an audience rather than bravery to kind of stand up against it, especially when it comes to things like violence and those sorts of things.
Adam, Saeed and I were talking before the show. I mentioned him that language I developed with friends at Torrington High School, real sophomoric stuff used with friends. He and I were talking, and he said this is kind of like a cryptolect. Do you know what that is, Adam? And why would that be relevant to what we're talking about with the language young people use online today?
Yeah, a cryptolect is a secret language, and we've seen different cryptolects in criminal groups before, or even just minority groups that need a way to express themselves outside of the police surveillance. And everybody creates their own microdialects. You have a microdialect with your family. So it's not strange that an online community would come up with a dialect, especially if they're trying to hide a part of their identity or create a shared identity for themselves. They might turn to these cryptolects, which is an obscure way of talking. If you go on in the incel forums, which I do not recommend, it really is unrecognizable unless you're highly versed in internet culture. So what you end up with is a language which is almost not even English anymore. It's pretty unrecognizable if you speak normal English. So an incel online will feel like somebody's actually speaking their language, but an incel offline will not be able to relate as much because your mother and your father and your school counselor will not have the terms or the playing ground to meet you at. There's simply a mismatch in the type of language that's being used.
During the first administration that Trump was in the White House, was often criticized the administration as using dog whistles. Is that still the case now that we're in the second administration? Are they still getting that rub?
Yeah, 100%. Language has always this implied extra meaning. And while the word itself can be a neutral tool, and I think maxing itself does not connote misogyny, the context in which it is used, and especially if it's used by a government official to describe a war action, 100% signals something to the manosphere.
On the Department of Homeland Security's Instagram page, a post using Chad imagery associated with incel culture was posted depicting the character searching through the DHS website and looking at immigrants convicted of crime. How are memes being utilized by the Trump administration, and for what purpose?
It again creates that boundary of irony and reality, which we can hopscotch between. And if it's a offensive thing, we can just say, oh, it was a joke, our bad. And then there's a plausible deniability that you're not dealing with reality anymore. The humor here serves to lessen the severity of what's actually happening. And you'll see the Department of War is also posting all these video game images and all this kind of online language and online memes that are related to war, but not actually the war itself. And that's because it sort of serves to confuse the idea of war with this mimetic idea of war, that the stuff you've seen in video games and movies, which doesn't actually reflect the bloodshed on the ground. And a similar thing with the ICE raids. If you gamify it, turn it into this trivial internet thing, it loses its gravity in real life.
In addition to the hyper-masculine Chad, are there other images that got their start on message boards like 4chan that you see proliferating in the political space?
Yeah, the word chud, which originally described a far-right person derogatorily, leaked into the mainstream and is now sort of a general insult. The word sigma was originally describing an idealized man in the manosphere who goes their own way. We're seeing yeah, a lot of terms kind of like that: maxing, pilled, cucked, mogging. All of these terms that sort of reflect that idea of a hierarchy that is there.
Saeed, do you have any thoughts about the toxicity of certain images or memes and the impact that has on young men in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it serves a purpose of just sort of desensitizing us to overt violence that we see when we see other human beings constantly being harmed in a sense of humor. It can really just make it seem, like Adam has said, as part of just mainstream media, and it really just serves to sort of desensitize us at a time when honestly a lot of these online spaces kind of tell us that our emotions, our range of emotions, is a problem. So if you're anything but angry, that means you're a failure. If you have some sort of empathy, remember we've heard this in a lot of this discourse with this administration about empathy being a deficit, empathy being an issue for people too. We have too much empathy. So I think this is all being served to really continue to desensitize us and also attract us a little bit more to that violence. On the other hand, I will also say this for people who don't, for especially young men who do not buy into this ideology, seeing this sort of constant, barrage of imagery around violence and maybe like ICE raids and things like that could actually serve to sort of radicalize people in sort of a different way, where it could cause people who have a different kind of ideology to really want to like fight back against this and try to find means of fighting back against that. So I think a lot of online spaces, we've actually seen a lot of like really lefty men sort of also wondering like, where do weapons come into play here? I know the algorithms who try to really push us to a certain direction around our emotions might also push weapons imagery to us as a way to say we can also protect our communities from this sort of tyranny and this sort of thing. So it really serves multiple ways and multiple directions depending on what your ideological loyalties lie.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We got to hear from Adam Alexic today. He's an American linguist and content creator known as the Etymology Nerd. Adam, also the author of Algo Speak, How Social Media is Transforming the Future of Language. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So great to have you on. Dr. Hill, stay on, because we're going to be back to dive deeper into language and extremism. We're here to talk about all of this. Hit us up now at 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Maybe we'll take some of your calls. Back with more Wheelhouse after a short break. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Earlier, we talked about how polarizing content has made its way into the mainstream and even our politics. Now we'll talk about what this means in the future and if interventions are possible. Back with us is Dr. Saeed Hill, a counseling psychologist and independent consultant in the field of men and masculinities. Folks, call us in the next few minutes if you'd like to get on before the show ends. We're taking calls on anything and everything we're talking about today, including language, extremism, polarization. If you're brief, we can talk about anything. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Can we talk about interventions, Saeed? Like, how would you address someone using the type of language we've heard today on the show if they were in your office?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if I hear people using this sort of language, I already know something about them. I know they're probably chronically online, but I also don't want to assume that they just buy into completely this sort of ideology. For example, I'm very familiar with these terms. I don't buy into this sort of ideology, but I just have an understanding of it. A lot of boys and men are just chronically online. Many of us struggle to form communities offline for various reasons. And so I do think that, number one, just seeing that people have this sort of language and vocabulary doesn't necessarily tell us something about them, as opposed, except that they're just online quite a bit. On the other hand, if I'm seeing that a lot of people are sort of buying into this sort of ideology, I think I just sort of ask like what this ideology sort of provides to them. Something people need to understand is that a lot of this language is protective for people. It helps describe when people are in pain, when people feel isolated, when people feel lonely. Language helps people describe how they feel, right? And so if there is a community of language, trying to just attack that or criticize it could have the opposite effect or impact. So I think you just need to have, if you're working with folks like this, I try to have a lot of compassion for this. I try to understand that people are coming at this from a lot of different places and probably from a lot of different pain. And I might just ask, what is having this language? What is adopting this language? What does this community provide to you that you don't think other communities may? And through that, in establishing my relationship to them, I'm hoping to kind of demonstrate that you can actually establish a really caring, affirming relationship with someone offline that doesn't involve the degradation of other human beings around, especially those who have less power than they do.
As a harm reduction and community support specialist, you're having to have compassion for people. These are also conversations where you're having to have compassion in some way for men that have committed abuse.
Absolutely. So let me say this about the compassion conversation. I have a lot of compassion for these men because I think of harm as sort of a continuum as opposed to something that you are or are not. You are either harmful or are not harmful. I think, we've all used different language just to demean someone at some point, maybe make jokes that we think are just like small jokes. Adam was talking about this earlier. They're just jokes, and that sort of thing. If you use jokes, it doesn't necessarily mean you're overtly and explicitly physically harming someone for that matter. But there is a continuum there where the language can lead to those sorts of things. So, in my mind, I think I have a lot of compassion for that understanding. On the other hand, too, not everyone has to or can have compassion for these folks, right? It's hard. I think, especially when I talk to some women in my life or other people who have been harmed by men, regardless of their gender. If you've never received an apology in your life from somebody who's harmed you, from men in your life that's harmed you, if you've never seen someone be held accountable for these sorts of issues, I think it's really hard to have that kind of compassion for them. So I think, number one, to do this sort of work, you need to really do a deeper dive into your own biases, what traumas you're coming into this sort of work with. I had to really understand my relationship to men because I think it's Bell Hooks who sort of talks about, we often talk about how women are deeply afraid and conditioned to be afraid of men and experience violence from men, which is absolutely true. But we don't as much talk about how men also experience a lot of violence from men and are conditioned to be afraid of other men. I think of the example, just wait until your father gets home, right? Like when men hear that, when boys hear that, it's signaling something about your relationship to men. And so I think doing a deeper dive in your own psychology, your own biases, and trying to find that compassion is absolutely a precursor for this sort of work. But not everyone can do that or should be doing that.
I'm assuming that you're doing it this way, the way that you're doing your work, because there is a continuum of violence that's continuing. So you're having to work in a way that's non-traditional, sort of restorative justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about your efforts?
Yeah, so I work a lot in what we might call like restorative practices or alternative resolutions, meaning like I might work with people who have either been accused of harm, have actually caused harm already, or are just trying to explore the impact that they've had in a relationship, maybe a negative impact that they've had on people in their lives, whether that be sexual violence, relationship violence, stalking, and those sorts of things. The efforts to do it this way is to try to understand that accountability can happen in a lot of different ways. And most of the time, what we do a really great job of is holding people accountable in rather punitive or carceral ways, or like cancel culture kind of stuff. And what actually happens when we're talking about, like, for example, incel communities and the manosphere in particular, is when people are sort of, they mess up and they maybe harm people too in their lives, and they need to be held accountable for that. We often reject them from society and kind of push them somewhere else. And then they find themselves into these communities who say, we accept you, we love you, we care about you, when they don't really. But it gives them sort of this idea that, like, hey, I'm going to go to this community and find refuge. I'm going to be supported. I'm going to be loved. And so if you're able to sort of show them that accountability can kind of happen where, hey, this is tough work to hold yourself accountable and have a community hold you accountable, but we take that responsibility on a community level to help heal and to, like, really address these sorts of issues, then it kind of shows them that like, hey, I can be accepted back into society, and I can just work really hard at that.
You using the word accountable triggered this Pavlovian response into me, into what we talked about in a pre-interview conversation. You had the occasion to talk to a white supremacist, and you used the word accountable with that person. It was fascinating. Tell us how that kind of played out.
Sure. When you're doing this sort of work in men and masculinities, you sort of you don't always know if you're like working like in the kind of work that I'm sort of doing, or you're finding yourselves into some sort of like men's rights, white supremacy sort of space. And so I found myself in a Zoom room. Long story, but I found myself in a Zoom room with a man who was a self-described, men's rights activist, a known white supremacist, and also has a history of domestic and sexual violence accusations and that sort of thing. And he kind of asked a little bit. We were talking about the work that I was doing, and I said, I help to try to hold people accountable, and I just talked about like the word accountability. And he audibly scoffed at me and rolled his eyes. And I think that's a moment where I, as a clinician and as a person who does this sort of work, I'm just curious about that response. So instead of sort of arguing with him about that, I sort of just said, "I'm curious about that. Your response to that." And he described being held accountable, and he says, when you do something wrong and people beat you when you're down, they kick on you, they spit on you, they reject you, and who wants to live that sort of life? And I thought that was really illuminating about his experience of what accountability really looks like. And all I really said to him was, honestly, that sounds really painful. And I'm really sorry to hear that. And I'm sorry that no one's ever in your life been able to hold you accountable in a loving and affirming way. And honestly, he had no idea how to respond to that, because it might have been like the first time anyone's ever kind of taken that angle with him. And he sort of like paused for a while. He looked at me for a minute, and then he just said, "You know what? Your work sounds interesting." And that was kind of the end of that sort of interaction. But I think it gives you a real illuminated like idea into the psychology of how people think about accountability work and what it means to just say you're sorry or take responsibility. And I think we see that in a lot of societal things right now, when people kind of look at saying I apologize, I'm sorry, and taking accountability as weakness when it's really not.
What events have we seen that could be tied back to extremist ideas or the sort of language we've been talking about today that proliferates online?
I mean, I think in general, you can kind of think of any like mass violence that we sort of see. I mean, there's a lot of studies looking at mass weapons and gun violence, for example, in history. I think of people like Elliot Rodger in California, who in his manifesto sort of talked about a day of retribution for women who rejected him in some context. Omar Mateen, who was the Orlando nightclub shooter who had a history of violence and domestic violence against his ex. Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas shooter. I mean, it goes on and on. The list is on and on. When you look at some studies, they kind of show that many of these men are either targeting, who are engaging in mass shooting and mass violence, are targeting maybe specific women in their lives, usually exes or current partners that they have, romantic partners. Or it might be women in their lives who have maybe rejected them, or women in general, because they represent sort of a rejection of, their sort of themselves, an inability to have sexual relationships or romantic relationships with others. And so consistently you see across some studies it's a quarter, some it's even half of even mass shootings have some sort of documented history of domestic sexual violence, being in incel communities, being on online forums that are sort of building community around the hatred of women, saying, hey, all of your issues that you have are actually about women and not anything else. They're about the hatred of women, and to regain a sort of sense of power, or to even have power in the first place, it's about control of women and people who are less than. And so let's give you the language to describe these people, and then let's give you access to even weapons and an ideology that tells you to go out and reclaim control at the expense of these people.
Let's bring a caller into this conversation. Zach from Meriden dialed 888-720-9677 to speak with us this morning. Go ahead, Zach.
Thanks for taking my call. I'm curious if you might be able to speak on any systems-related interventions that might speak to more root causes of loneliness, masculinity challenges around the incel and red and black pill communities. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Zach. One thing, thank you so much for calling, Zach. One thing I found interesting that you were talking about when we talked in a pre-interview conversation that might be able to answer that question. You actually worked with the Biden administration, I think it was a couple of years ago, on ways that we could sort of address issues of online harassment. And there were certain groups and stakeholders that were sort of the subjects of this. Obviously, women and survivors of these attacks were a part of it, but also were the men and potential interventions part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was on the White House, an old Biden administration White House task force to address online harassment and abuse. So it was kind of bringing together a lot of people from different mediums who can address just the psychology of how people, how basically things like violence is perpetrated in real life can kind of stem from like online harassment and abuse, and also how people are also abused and harassed online in particular and what to do about it. A lot of the interventions that we sort of talk about are, can we really find spaces where we can really create community for young men and boys, even offline. So if we're going to be online, can we have online bystander intervention trainings where we sort of talk to people about what it means to see and witness harassment online, maybe in gaming forums, for example, and address harm in real time. When you start to really use sort of active bystander intervention strategies of interrupting harassment online, it sort of then creates sort of a normalcy around that, where people understand that this is a space where that kind of thing is not going to be tolerated. The real thing, though, is we can say all day that we need to get people offline, but what are they going online to? So to kind of get to the caller's question about this, there's a lot of different organizations, usually around like colleges and universities, but a lot of nonprofits too, that sort of have violence prevention, masculinity-based groups that are sort of bringing men together to do violence prevention work. A big part of that isn't, though, just having them do the work of violence prevention by going out there and doing education about it. It's about learning about yourself. It's about learning about how all these systems, the rigid or what I call restrictive masculinity, this idea that you have to be one type of man at all times. You have to always be the protector, always be the provider, always be strong, always be resilient. And if you are not any of those things all the time, then you're less than. Let's learn about that. Let's learn about how these systems and online spaces are trying to stoke insecurity in you, and learning about that. Learn about your history, learn about your story, learn about emotional intelligence and those sorts of things, and how to respond to your emotions instead of letting them spiral out of control and harm people around you. So there's absolutely groups and organizations out there that are doing this sort of work. I think of work like organizations like Equimundo or Futures Without Violence. I think there's some particular, Movember is another one, A Call to Men. There's a lot of different organizations that help set up groups, dedicated to looking and examining this. And so we should be looking more into that sort of education in society.
Saeed, I only have about a minute left, not even. So I want to give you this last one. When we don't call out misogynistic and dehumanizing language online, let's focus on the women here, and ultimately don't work to eradicate the problem. What does it mean for women of other marginalized groups like women of color, undocumented women, LGBTQ plus populations? Give us about 30 seconds on this and what it means for them.
I mean, when we sort of are like deeply embedded in this psychology online, it comes at the expense of women, of people who are more marginalized in different ways than us, and it contributes to the violence against them. We know how much violence mass violence impacts women. And so in particular, I think like what this really does is causes a disconnect in relationships between men and women in particular, and men in these organizations. Men, at a time when we're saying we want more relationships, are following people who don't know how to establish relationships with other people, and it leaves us lonely and isolated. Doing this sort of healing work brings us back together, and we need to do more of that.
Thank you for closing up there. I appreciate it. Dr. Saeed Hill, counseling psychologist and independent consultant. Thank you so much for your work. Today's show was produced by Davina Cordero and Tale Ricketson. Edited by Patrick Scahill. Thank you so much to Dylan Reyes and the rest of the team. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Thank you for listening.